I thought I would try and highlight a couple of things which to me seem to be pretty significant. And maybe I should just say at the outset, like Linda, I was a member of Parliament for a considerable period of time. Linda, I hope you're able to keep that in view, because near the end of my last time as a member of Parliament, I chaired the Environment Committee of the House of Commons. And the Environment Committee was a spectacular committee, not because I was the chairman of it, because at that point in time in the late 80s, environment was a very big issue, so everybody wanted to be on that committee. Can you believe that I had, at one and the same time, both Sheila Copps and Paul Martin as the vice chair of my committee? It gives you kind of a sense of, the importance that was being attached more than 20 years ago to the work we were doing. And what was really interesting about it was early on in our time together as a first ever environment committee was to decide what it is we should spend our time at. And after not too long discussion, we agreed that climate change was the issue that we really had to come to grips with. We spent not just a few sessions or not just a few months, we spent 3.5 years of holding all the hearings with all of the key players in order to produce several reports. In fact, I should have brought a couple with me today just to wave them around. I may bring them out tomorrow and show them to you, because what is interesting, if you read those reports even now, 20 years later, is that basically all the work was done. We knew then what was happening and what we needed to be doing. And I wish I could stand here 20 years later and say, and we acted accordingly. Of course, it didn't happen. And some of the analysis of that, I think, we've had today, again, or repeated today. But I think, in a way, it was, what we were coming up with was so shocking, so difficult to really take in, that it took us a long time to finally, as the old saying goes, have the penny drop. Now, most people tend to dismiss Copenhagen as a kind of major failure. Being somewhat of a contrarian, I take a somewhat different view. I think Copenhagen was incredibly important historically. I went there. I mean, I hadn't been to a UN meeting for maybe 10 or 15 years, and when a group of us, Marty and Joy Kennedy and Alana Mitchell and Marty's son, Chris, and I decided we were all going to go and witness this epic event, we weren't quite prepared for what actually happened. In the planning, it seemed like they expected around 15,000, maybe a few more, to turn up. In the event, 50,000 people tried to get in the doors or in the windows or get in whatever they could. And it became an impossible event. That was sort of, the people who came to be part of this historic meeting. And then, of course, you had the key players who were, for the most part, in a separate part of the main building, the Bella Center, trying to negotiate through to the sort of post-Kyoto picture. And of course, the whole thing just came tumbling down. But, and this is an important but, I want to say, the fact is that most, if not all, the key players were there. And I think we need to think about that for a second. I was at Rio. I was deeply involved in the preparation for Rio. I came to Rio. I took part in many of the discussions at Rio. But not all the key players were there. And in particular, the most key player wasn't there, and that's George Bush. That's the other George Bush, for those of you who are too young to remember it. George Herbert Walker Bush. And we almost didn't get a climate change treaty because they were saying, we're going to oppose this thing because it is absolutely opposed to all the values we have in the United States of America. Well, we got the treaty, and much later, a few years later, we got the Kyoto Protocol. We don't have to spend time looking at that, but what concerns me is that, I think as the old saying goes, we've got people's attention. The other thing that's really important, because I wandered around the Bella Center in the early days before the other 20 or 30,000 arrived, and was able to kind of see what the lay of the land was with the hundreds and maybe more thousands of groups that were there trying to talk about their particular vantage point on what climate change is all about. What was interesting from my point of view is that almost none of the discussion was on, is the science accurate? Is it going to be this much change or that much change? It was all about, what are we going to do? Now, that may be skewed towards the sort of activists, and I grant you that. But it was highly unusual that you had, among all those people who came from wherever, talking about what they were going to do, as against the kind of discussions, the complicated, confused discussions that went on within the sort of UN group in trying to see what kind of agreement they could come to that everybody would sign on and yet might accomplish something. Kind of an impossible task. And particularly impossible when most of the people who were at the table didn't have the ability to make much of a decision. Until the last few days you were there, mostly with ministers of the environment. This issue's moved way beyond ministers of the environment. I think I put in one of the little columns I was writing for the Observer during the 2 weeks that I was there that the next meeting should include, or should have primarily ministers of finance, if not leaders of government, but certainly ministers of finance, those who are making the big decisions around where the economic priorities are. Because to my mind, this is no longer really an environmental discussion. It's a discussion about how and what government policy is being made and what the rest of us should be doing in the context of that.